Mike, good evening to you. Now, analysts say the crisis is partly linked to migration. Just tell us what that link is.
Yeah, absolutely, Sally. So we must be clear, we're not saying that migrants are terrorists per se. Basically, the issue with migration is that a lot of migrants who move across the continent face real socio-economic challenges, and often they're sucked into radical groups like this one. And we're going to focus on a study, Sally, which really paints a really interesting picture. But first, I want to just give you some context in terms of what this group has actually done in Mozambique. 350 civilian deaths during the course of 2019. 100,000 people were displaced from their homes. Some reports suggest over the last few years, 250,000 people have actually been displaced in northern Mozambique. So a chaotic region, to say the least. But let's focus on that study. So the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, looked at around about 45,000 migrant movements. So basically tried to track migrants as they moved south from the Horn of Africa all the way through to South Africa, encompassing countries like Ethiopia, Tanzania, Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And that route that you're seeing there, Sally, it's known as the Southern Route. Now, 71% of migrants will simply move from Somalia, which is ravaged with all sorts of problems, to Kenya. But 8% will actually make their way from Ethiopia to South Africa. 8% might not sound like a lot, Sally, but remember, we're talking about thousands of migrants to start with. So quite a substantial part of the migration group is effectively trying to get to South Africa. And here's the thing, they come through northern Mozambique, which of course is vulnerable to radical ideologies.
So now, when they move through Mozambique, and we know that for a lot of these migrants, it takes sometimes years to travel all the way down. Some of it is done on foot. But what is the situation with a bit of a bottleneck where people are kind of getting stuck there in northern Mozambique? Why has that been happening? Because we know that in the last 3 years there has been more militant activity in that area. So something must have changed geopolitically.
Absolutely, very good point. Let's focus on our next map, Sally, and we'll give you some perspective on that. So where you're seeing that pulsing dot there, Sally, that is Mozambique de Praia. This is the port city that this terrorist group has actually captured. And what you're seeing really, Sally, is that bottleneck, and it's related to two key moments of the past 10 years. So in 2010, South Africa urged its neighbors to try to control immigration and illegal immigration much more, to try and control its borders. That was because Al-Shabaab in East Africa was launching all sorts of attacks in that region. So it said to its neighbors, we have to control our borders a lot more. 5 years later, Tanzania did something similar, launching a crackdown, Sally, in terms of illegal immigration. And what is smack bang between South Africa and Tanzania? Well, it happens to be Mozambique. And it seems like, as you said, a bottleneck has formed. And so a lot of those migrants are getting stuck in northern Mozambique. And because they're struggling to survive, they're struggling to make a living, perhaps more vulnerable to radical ideologies like extremist Islam. And here's a key stat I want to focus on very quickly, Sally, just as we wrap things up. Analysts say that 94% of the migrants who travel this route are young males, most of them from Ethiopia and Somalia. And we know that extreme groups do tend to target young males when they're trying to bring them in to the fold. So perhaps the migrants are vulnerable to the kinds of ideas which we are seeing in northern Mozambique.
And it certainly gives a really interesting perspective on the fact, you know, on, I think it was Monday, SADC met for their 40th summit, and the issue of what was going on in northern Mozambique, and a response was discussed. That sort of context is crucial when factoring in what the region does in response.
Absolutely. I know you're going to speak to an analyst, Sally, in about an hour, and what many of them are saying is that you can't simply adopt a military approach. You have to focus on the socio-economic reasons for these radical ideologies and why they tend to take root in particular areas.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Michael Marilia.